Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? And welcome back to Spanish Classes with Professor Jason. This class is going to focus on the passive voice in Spanish. And I'm going to talk about two ways to use the passive approach in Spanish. Both using the verb ser with the past participles in Spanish and using the se form of the passive in Spanish. Okay? This is just going to be an overview of two different ways to use the passive in Spanish. All right? So we'll take a look at two different ways of forming the passive voice in Spanish. The first way we'll look at uses the verb ser and the past participle forms of the verb. Remember those verbs that end in ado or ido usually. Okay? And then the second type we'll look at is the se passive. Okay? These are two very different ways of using the passive voice in Spanish. But quickly, before we look at the ser passive, let's talk about what the passive voice is. In English, many times we use the active voice, and I'll give you a simple example to express how a subject impacts an object with a verb. Juan threw the ball. Okay, Juan threw the ball. Here we have a subject, a verb, and an object, which is the typical syntactical order of English sentences, right? Subject, verb, object. Juan is the subject. He's also the agent. He's also the person carrying out the action of the verb. And we have the verb and the direct object, ball. Okay? If we were to write this in the passive voice, it might look something like this. The ball now becomes the subject, was thrown by Juan. Okay, the ball was thrown by Juan. All right. Another example in English in active voice would be something like Maria answered the phone. Okay. Again, we have subject, verb, object, where she is also the agent. Okay. But again, change the syntactical order into passive voice, where sort of the direct object becomes our subject, would be, you can guess it easily now, the phone was answered by, and now the agent comes at the end, by Maria. Okay? By Maria. The phone was answered by Maria. So that gives you an idea of what the passive voice is, at least in English, right? Active voice, we have our subject, verb, object. In passive voice, what was the direct object becomes the subject, and by Juan is thrown on at the end. Our verb forms change also to a compound sort of arrangement, a form of the verb to be, and that's where the verb ser in Spanish will come in with the past participle. Okay? So let me show you those same examples in Spanish, because the parallel to English is very apparent and reliable. So, the active voice version of Juan threw the ball would be Juan tiró, our verb in the preterite tense, la pelota. Notice again, subject, verb, object, which also happens to be the typical predominant syntactical order of the Spanish language. Now, to change this into the passive voice using the verb ser, I'm going to put the object at the front, now becomes the subject, la pelota, and it's important that we realize that this is the subject because there are some agreement issues. La pelota, putting our verb in the past tense, okay, in the preterite, fue tirada, we'll talk about why that ends in a, por, and then our agent, who was our subject, Juan. Okay, I say he was our subject because now the subject is la pelota, which means that any verbs have to agree, so singular. And this tirada reflects the fact that pelota is feminine. Entonces, la pelota fue tirada por Juan. Okay, the ball was thrown by Juan. How about our other example? Maria, in the active voice in Spanish, answered the phone, contestó, preterite form, él teléfono. María contestó el teléfono. Okay? And the passive voice would be el teléfono. I think it sounds horrible, but el teléfono fue contestado, masculine forms, por María at the end. Okay? So that's the passive voice in Spanish using ser, and usually it's going to come out as fue if our subject is singular, or fueron if our subject happens to be plural, like if we change this to the balls were thrown, right? Las pelotas fueron tiradas por Juan. Okay, and then plus the past participle, which in Spanish usually end in ado or ido, but have to be modified to agree with the new subject of the sentence, right? So that's the passive using ser in the past participle. Let me quickly go on and give some examples of the other type of passive voice, which uses se and a verb form. Okay, so let me give an example of an active voice. You need a subject. Again, you could use like el empleado closed the store, cerró la tienda a las 9. He closed the store at 9 o'clock. El empleado cerró la tienda a las 9. Well, when the agent is not very important or can be left out, and the main point of the sentence is that the store closed at 9, we could write something in the passive voice like la tienda se cerró a las 9. La tienda se cerró a las 9. Again, using the preterite form of the verb, and this verb also agrees in number with the singular la tienda se cerró a las 9. Okay, we could have something like, I don't know, Picasso pintó, he painted los cuadros en 1942. Okay, Picasso pintó los cuadros en 1942. He painted the paintings. Now, for some reason, we wanted to just focus on the paintings being painted. We could take out our agent. The paintings now become the subject. Los cuadros se pintaron. Now here we have the preterite form of, in the third person plural, pintaron, and then in the year, in 1942. So again, here we have an agreement in terms of the verb being in the third person plural. Okay, here we have third person singular, la tienda se cerró a las 9. Here we have third person plural, los cuadros se pintaron en 1942. Okay, now again, this could be used, we could express this using the passive with ser in the past participle, right? Los cuadros fueron pintados, or la tienda fue cerrada. It's just a stylistic choice. The important thing is, in both the ser and the se passive, our verb has to agree with the new subject. And when you use the se passive, you can't use por. Okay? It would sound horrible to say los cuadros se pintaron en 1942 por. Right? If you wanna name the agent, stick with the ser passive. Okay? This has been a very, admittedly, too brief of an overview of the passive voice in Spanish using ser and se, but hopefully if you rewind and review, it'll make a little bit of sense and it's been a helpful lesson. This is Professor Jason signing off. Until next time. Muchas gracias.